So, hi everyone. Thank you for joining us for the human side. Before we begin, we would like to extend a brief message of strength and care to you. We are living through tough times, especially with the second COVID wave in India, and we sincerely hope that your family and you are safe. We are grateful to have you with us here, and we hope that certain aspects of this conversation might help us to understand the current situation a little bit better, especially to explore our position as social scientists in this crisis situation. So over the past year, we have witnessed the development of COVID pandemic situation. This has been a global crisis where the physical sciences have significantly contributed towards understanding the nature of virus, the ways in which it has been developing, and most importantly, the rolling out of vaccines to manage the situation. This is, of course, a very short and non-exhaustive list of the ways in which physical sciences have helped us during the pandemic situation. Along with the physical sciences, human and social sciences have enabled the translation of scientific information into actionable insights, say in the form of public policy decisions. Social scientists also have been critical in communicating scientific information to the public. Social sciences are also fundamental tools to analyze the cognitive assessments and collective behaviors that have developed during the pandemic. In many ways, at least publicly, there has been a lack of discussion about the role of social scientists during the pandemic, which does not reflect the extent of contributions that social sciences do and have made over the past year. The human side is a humble attempt to talk about the ways in which social scientists from various disciplines have looked at and contributed to understanding the pandemic. We believe that social sciences are decisive in shaping the collective management of this and future epidemics and pandemics. To this end, we have with us today three distinguished panel speakers. Please join me in welcoming the first panel speaker of Human Science, sociologist Aliya Rao. She is an assistant professor in the Department of Methodology. Her research interests span the study of work in organizations, family, gender, economic sociology, and emotions. She uses qualitative methods to understand social mechanisms which may facilitate or impede the production of inequalities at work and in families. Thank you for being here, Aliya. The second panel speaker for today is philosopher Jan Helge Solbakk. He is a Norwegian physician, theologian, and professor of medical ethics at the University of Oslo. His main fields of research are moral residue, the didactics of bioethics and science ethics, research ethics, and integrity in research. He's also involved in several international capacity building projects in research ethics and research integrity. We are glad to have you here with us, Jan. And the third panel speaker is historian Monica Green. She was previously a professor of history at Arizona State University. She is an expert in the history of women's healthcare and pre-modern Europe, medicine and gender, and she specializes in the history of infectious diseases in pre-modern period. It's wonderful to have you with us here, Monica.
Thank you.
Now, before we move on to the first segment, I thought we could do a quick round of hi from our moderators for today. From OP Jindal Global University, here is sociologist Juhi Singh, historian Saumya, and philosopher. I feel a bit vain saying that, but I'm going to go forward and say philosopher. Hi there, Sahana. Unfortunately, Richa could not join us. She is our dear friend and she's going through a little bit of a tough time. So from afar, thank you, Richa, for helping us through this. So we are going to get to the first segment now. And before we begin, I would like to request everyone to mute your cameras, mute your microphones. We would love to see your faces. Please feel free to start your cameras if that's comfortable with you. So in this segment, our moderators will ask research-specific questions to our panel speakers. So I request Juhi to carry the session forward with Aliya Rao. Over to you, Juhi.
Thank you, Sahana. And thank you again, Aliya, for joining us in this session. We are really glad to have you here. And as Sahana very elaborately mentioned about that how the major aim of this panel discussion is around developing scientific perspectives from social scientist viewpoint in understanding the ramifications this pandemic has brought for us. So my question emerges from my curiosity to understand further the aftermath of unemployment on men and women separately occurred due to this current pandemic. And Aliya, I ask this question in light of your recent publication, Crunch Time, that how married couples confront unemployment. First of all, many congratulations for this amazing piece of work. Could you please give an overview around your motivation to start this line of investigation, and how it helps us to understand the wrath of unemployment on men and women in this time of crisis separately. Yeah, over to you, Ali.
Thanks for your question, Juhi, and thank you so much for having me on the panel today. I'll just give a little bit of an overview over the research that I've done to kind of situate Juhi's question in that. So my research has looked at unemployment among white collar workers in the US context. And the reason I focused on that demographic, so white collar, I mean, people who've finished a college degree, who work in an occupation that requires that college degree, sort of professionals in a way, right? And the reason I focused on that is because a lot of the research that we have on unemployment, especially in the Western context, really kind of imagines that the unemployed individual, the unemployed subject, is a man, right? What that means is that most of this research has kind of focused on the impact of losing a job on issues of masculinity, on your identity when you are not a breadwinner anymore, how that, for instance, impacts then your things like your marriage, things like your father role, and so on. And to be honest, like this is a really good line of research, and it's like shown some. It has some really useful models that it's shown out that are demographic models that are about health and well-being and so on, and very important research. But it's what it doesn't take into account is the fact that at least since the 1970s in the U.S. context, women have really been a part of the labor force, and at this point, women with young children are also a dominant part of the labor force. So kind of omitting their experiences as unemployed subjects altogether, I thought was a bit of empirically limited our understandings. But conceptually, one could imagine that if masculinity is the key way, if ideologies of masculinity are the key way that unemployment matters for men, and ideologies of masculinity may not apply to women in the same way, right? Like the kind of expectations we have from women still very much center them as carers. And that's something we've seen a lot in this pandemic with the division of paid and unpaid work and how that's kind of playing out in households the world over, really. So that was like the theoretical impetus for me to kind of conduct this study. I focused on white collar workers because sociologists and social scientists, since sort of the dawn of industrialization, I can say, have examined unemployment, but they've also examined unemployment amongst basically low-wage workers. So, this issue of like factories been shut down and so on. And I think, again, that's very important. But what it misses out on is that the economic tumult of our kind of everyday life now since the 80s, definitely in the US and in some other sort of Western contexts as well, white collar workers have also been impacted. And I think just for me, sociologically, to understand their experiences is important. Another reason really is that white collar workers, even though they may be more objectively protected, like they may have more economic resources to weather unemployment, these are not people who, for instance, you typically get pushed into poverty or get pushed into homelessness after a job loss, right? They have resources, yet they actually have the worst emotional responses to unemployment. Now, social scientists, primarily psychologists, for instance, have pointed out that this is probably because they don't have, white collar workers sort of don't necessarily expect to face that much adversity, right? So that's one, they don't have the psychological buffers in a way that someone who's a low wage worker who's sort of expecting to encounter adversity at every step they might have. So for me, the emotional dimension of it was very important. So that was what motivated it. I feel like I've talked for a while, but I can carry on explaining my findings, but I can also stop.
Please, you may continue for it.
So that explains why I did this study. And what I did was basically I went out, I interviewed unemployed men, their wives, sometimes their children. I interviewed unemployed women, their husbands, sometimes their children, and I observed families experiencing unemployment. What I mean is I hung out with them for a period of 2 to 3 weeks for anywhere from 2 to 8 hours a day, trying to understand what unemployment meant for the daily rhythm of their life. Like, who was doing cooking at this time, who was cleaning, who was picking the kids up, what were they talking about? Were they talking about job searching, or were they talking about other things? That's what I was trying to understand. And again, this is in the US context. And what I found is that for men, unemployment in men's families, unemployment is framed as this major problem that you need to get reemployed really quickly, regardless of whether the man had been the primary earner or whether he'd earned as much or even less than the than his spouse, right? So what that meant was his focus on his reemployment meant that his time and space was actually protected to help him focus on searching for a job and getting re-employed quicker. In the cases of unemployed women, it was a different scenario. Unemployed women, including when they earned significantly more than their husbands, their unemployment was seen as a sort of, okay, this is not an ideal situation, but it's not the worst thing ever either. Now you kind of get time to be, I mean, I literally had one participant say you get to be the kind of mom, she gets to be the kind of mom she couldn't be before, right? So for unemployed women, their time was not protected for job searching. Instead, it was expected that because they don't have a job, they should be contributing by basically taking over all the unpaid work. This means things like all the cooking, all the cleaning, taking care of all the kids. So when they were searching for jobs, it was a very fragmented way of searching. Their days weren't organized around it. They would, do it, they would get up a little bit earlier in the morning to do it. When they're waiting for their kid at his extracurricular activities, they'd sit down, at the bleachers and kind of fill out a job application form, things like that. So just the way that unemployment was understood in these pretty comparable families of unemployed men and women was very different. And it shaped how then men and women searched for jobs.
Yeah. Thank you for such an elaboration, actually. It really helped us a lot in understanding this wrath of unemployment that has happened recently. A question emerging from all your elaborations only is I also wanted to understand that through your case studies, how visible it was around that how the gender roles were being, like you talked about it a little bit, but then how can you conclude this thing that was it a reiteration of the gender roles, or there was some kind of redefinition of it also traditionally, like reiteration of the gender roles traditionally, or there was some kind of redefining towards that?
Sure. So the way I would see it is that what I just explained to you was like the broader story, like the dominant theme. But there was some redefining going on. Another thing I want to point out is unemployment can be seen as a sort of unsettled time. And during unsettled time, you can kind of fall back on what sociologists would call very traditional scripts, like these very gendered ways of being, or you can use new scripts. So the dominant story for me was sort of falling back on very gender traditional scripts, but there was some redefining, and that happened with a subset of men in particular who did sort of rethink of themselves and their roles in the family. So they didn't, for instance, downplay the work of being a carer. They kind of valued their role as fathers, for instance, and spending time with kids. And some of them considered, to what extent they needed to search for jobs or whether the job should be time consuming, because they had kind of really valued the time with their family. With unemployed women, that didn't happen so much. With unemployed women, it was sort of safer to kind of go into the what one participant said, stay-at-home mom mode, because that was also a culturally validated identity that she could access, which, when she was sort of working full-time in a busy and demanding job, she had felt that she was kind of being judged by peers and stuff around her. So this was a way of kind of gaining some respect with a different identity in a way almost.
Actually, yeah. I think I am almost done with my questions. I can take up my further questions for the next theme. Yeah, over to you, Sahana, and thank you so much for Aliya for this elaboration. Yes.
Okay.
Over to you, Sahana.
And Aliya. Hi, Jan. I recently, I'm going to be directing my question. I recently read your paper, Back to What? The Role of Research Ethics in Pandemic Times. And I thought we could look closely at it for this segment. So you highlighted the need for us to stay committed to research ethics, to not adopt exceptionalism during a crisis situation like the pandemic. At some point in the paper, it was also mentioned you were in favor of ethics of precaution. So to begin with, could you share what exceptionalism is? What are the kind of research tendencies that might take over during crisis situations like the current one? Hey, Jan, I think you're on mute right now. Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you very much for the question. Well, exceptionalism is a word that tries to color, for example, the present situation as a situation that is completely new in some respect. And for this reason, we need also to find new ways of resolving problems. And within the context of research ethics, that is that we need to find new ethical rules of play because the situation is completely different from previous times, previous situations. And those bioethicists and research ethicists in favor, and also researchers in favor of using this label, this rhetoric label, is to justify forms of research that exposes individual research subjects to much higher risks, which cut the time space needed to develop safe vaccines, for example, or safe new drugs. And in this paper, we criticize this tendency to bend the rules by rephrasing the present situation as an exceptional situation. And we warn against this in the paper, and we also draw attention to the historical context. We should not forget that the ethical rules of play guiding medical and health-related research were carved out after a disaster even bigger than the present disaster, namely the Second World War, and the discovery of the horrible crimes against humanity that German and Japanese medical researchers had conducted and committed during the Second World War on concentration camp prisoners. So when a prominent bioethicist as Peter Singh at Princeton argue in favor of exceptionalism, he at the same time discloses a complete lack of historical knowledge, because to call the present time an exceptional situation in a research context is completely to disrespect the biggest human catastrophe in modern time, the Second World War, and the horrors that were done in the name of medical and health-related research.
In continuation of that, like especially in the context of like vaccines which are being produced and rolled out in the past months, could you share what would constitute what you have called epistemic shortcuts and how that could result in ethical pitfalls? So what kind of things have you seen happening in the current situation?
Well, on the one hand, the vaccines that are now in use, they have been developed during an extremely short time period, much shorter than the normal rules of play for developing vaccines. To this adds that at least two of these vaccines, the Moderna vaccine and the Pfizer vaccine, make use of a completely new method. These two things should not we need to keep in mind when we know more and more about some of the long-term serious side effects that will become a reality. Because the shorter time you use to test the safety and efficacy of a drug or a vaccine, the higher is the risk also that you will not disclose the really serious side effects.
Right. How does this, so you just pointed out, you just mentioned uncertainty, and this reminded me of the three kinds of uncertainty that you have talked about in your paper, which were, I think, risk, strict uncertainty, and ignorance. So do you think uncertainty triggers or leads to epistemic shortcuts? Like what have you seen in crisis situations?
Well, to start answering that, I think in developing that part of the paper, I'm very much inspired by the teacher of the philosopher who I wrote about in my doctoral thesis, namely Socrates. I wrote my thesis about Plato. And Socrates coined this term knowing ignorance. And his point was that if we compare what we actually know with what we actually does not know, our knowledge is so fragile, is so tiny. And in fact, in the last dialogue Plato wrote, the name in ancient Greece is nomoi, the laws. I think it's in the third book, he say, what value does it have to know what justice is in itself, or to know the divine circle that is pure geometry, if you are not able to find your way back home or build your own house? What did he mean by that? Well, to phrase it in a more modern way, a Swedish poet and Nobel laureate, Harry Martinson, in a science fiction poem labeled Anyara, he has a phrase that I use very much when I teach bioethics to researchers. My friend, you know too much without ever having thought about it. And I think that is what scares me now when prominent bioethicists, prominent researchers, and also medical decision makers and health authorities, they embrace exceptionalism. Right. My friends, you know too much without ever having thought about it. And it is exactly that is for me the role of the philosopher. This thinking about what is behind, trying to identify the different forms and kinds and levels of uncertainty and ignorance that we need to include when we make decisions.
Right. Just to wrap up, my last question is, are there any sort of tenets of what ethics of precaution would be in response to exceptionalism? What would you say are some of the basic, most tenets of research ethics that sort of strike you as important in a crisis situation?
Let me phrase my answer in a quite provocative way. Two standard characterizations of how bioethicists and philosophers should behave is that they should be some kind of helpful knower, providing advice to medical or other political decision makers, or they should act as a polite bystander that describes from distance, from their ivory tower, what is actually going on. But philosophers and bioethicists should not mess up with, should not become action-oriented. I think that is flatly wrong. It is due time, and not the least under the present pandemic, it is due time that philosophers and bioethicists enter the social world and use their knowledge, use their language, use their possibility of making some influence. And let me just illustrate that by one example. Now there is a lot of talk about vaccine nationalism.
Right.
This label is for me completely wrong. And from a precautionary point of view, I would say we need to deconstruct this concept.
Right.
And the way we can do that is to look at what are the implications of vaccine nationalism? What are the implications of the bilateral negotiations that the affluent countries in the world are doing in a pandemic context? Pandemos comes from two ancient Greek words, pan, which means all, and demos, people. All citizens of the globe, all inhabitants of the global city is in danger because of this pandemic. And the affluent countries act as this is a danger only affecting their own citizens. Vaccine nationalism should be labeled actions and acts pretty close to crimes against humanity. In CNN today, it was an article about India, and the title, I think, is important. The catastrophe in India now is a catastrophe for the whole world. And that is, for me, a way also of emphasizing the importance of the precautionary principle and also the precautionary way of making decisions. Because if we are going to fight this pandemic, we need to use epidemiological knowledge, and we need to justify it in a morally acceptable way. And then we know that the most efficient way would be to give the risk groups in every country first access to the vaccines, and then the rest of the populations in the different countries. But what is Norway doing? What is the European Union doing? What is the United States, Canada, Japan, etc. doing? What is Israel doing? They are committing crimes that are pretty close to humanity, because we know that the consequences of these acts is that millions of people in the poor part of the world will die because of the decisions and intentions made by democratic governments in the rich north.
Right. So one of the points that you just said really resonates with one of the motivations for this whole symposium, which was that to get people who are in different parts of the world to look at the situation which is there in India and to be able to resonate with the experience that they're as well going through during the pandemic. And I think you really raised a lot of points which are very pretty provocative. And I hope that we encourage the audience to please share your comments, thoughts on the chat, and we'll definitely weave it into the conversation, or we'll get to it during the discussion as well. Thank you so much for sharing that, Jan. And I'm going to pass on the baton to Saumya now. Thank you, Saumya. Thank you, Jan. Please take over, Saumya.
Thank you, Sahana. Hi, Professor Green. Hi, I hope you can hear me.
Hello, yes.
So, Professor Green, I have a very simple question for you. I teach economic history at JGBS, at the Jindal Global Business School. And more specifically, I teach the economic history of Western Europe, in which the Black Death is such a watershed moment. It transformed the regime of social production and created spaces wherein capitalism could emerge. One might also say that it paved the way for the emergence of the absolute state in the subsequent centuries. So, in my opinion, the post-industrial world is in the midst of the severest pandemic that it has faced in the past 250 odd years, in which it has emerged and shaped itself. So do you think this pandemic, in the light of your research, do you think this pandemic might be a similarly watershed moment in the history of our world, the post-industrial world?
Yes. And in answering that, let me explain more about what my contribution to Black Death history is. So at Black Death historiography has been going on in some kind of way for centuries. So there's a lot that goes under that umbrella of what the Black Death is and how we need to understand it. And I am not a specialist in the economic effects of the Black Death. So I'm coming in as a medical historian who's trying to reconstruct the epidemiology of that pandemic. And how that epidemiological approach affects the economic interpretations, I think remains to be seen. My sense, so I am trained as a medieval historian. My sense is that a lot of the assumptions that we have, a lot of the generalizations that we have about the impact of the Black Death are wrong. Sometimes they're completely wrong, and sometimes they're wrong because they take a limited amount of information from one geographical area or one political system and generalize it throughout the entire late medieval world. So in terms of the economic effects, I would say, okay, just looking at the Black Death, so that initial major hit of plague that we normally talk about when we talk about the Black Death. So coming into the Mediterranean, hitting the Near East, hitting North Africa, and hitting Europe. What you even see in those various regions is a lot of non-uniformity of economic impacts. What you do see, and the data just kind of keeps adding up, the impact, the demographic impact of the Black Death was enormous. It was, in terms of mortality, the largest pandemic in human history. So we're talking minimum 30% mortality in most regions. Documented cases of particular urban areas or particular regions go up to 40, 50, 60% mortality. That is stunning, that is shocking. And to talk about the effects of that kind of devastation on any society and then compare it to any other historical situation, your analogies grow thin, just because that one example is so extreme to apply it elsewhere. What I think is going on now, and there's, for example, there's a brand new study that is based on very, very close reading of sources from England. And I've only read parts of it yet, so this is not a complete description of it, but what he is showing is that, yes, some of the conclusions that were drawn about the economic effects, the political effects in England have been true. But he's also showing, for example, the immediate effects. I mean, just in those first few years after the Black Death arrived in England in 1348, up to maybe about 1360, so maybe a full decade, many places were just ravaged, not simply because of the deaths, but because what do those deaths do to the infrastructure of society? They take away your tax collectors, who you might not miss. But what that means is that the sources of revenue collapse. The sources of farming labor disappear. A lot of theft, a lot of criminality, a lot of just sheer destitution. Again, because of those infrastructures that have been collapsed. What I see, and I have been watching the COVID pandemic play out. I've been watching it very, very closely since January of 2020. What I see is very different impact, but in some ways equally cataclysmic. So to get back to your what I took to be your main question, do I think COVID-19 will be as big in terms of global history as the Black Death was? Yes. Yes, I see so many ways in which it is not the numbers of people that die, it's the disruption. It's the social, political, cultural disruption that happens. And that is the foundation of what pandemics do to societies. Now, the big thing that I've actually been doing, again, I'm not an economic historian, putting together the epidemiological part of this story, I've been using genetics. And I won't go into details about how genetics functions in this way, but essentially it allows us to track not the human deaths, which is what we can see from human-generated documents, but it allows us to track the pathogen. And what we see, and what I've discovered, is that the Black Death, or this massive dissemination of plague, happened a century and a half earlier than anybody thought that it happened before. It encompasses the better part of Eurasia. There's a possibility, yet to be proved, but there's a possibility that is on the table now that it also reached sub-Saharan West Africa by the latter part of the 14th century or early 15th century. So let me just take that last case as an example. And this is just, again, it's hypothetical at this point. But if this were true, if the signs that archaeologists have found in West Africa, that there is a pretty substantial depopulation of various areas in West Africa, there's a new narrative that we can create about disruptions of societies in West Africa, which can be explained in ways that could lead up to the beginning of European involvement in the slave trade. So slavery is not new in West Africa, but there are clearly some demographic shifts that go on in this. So these are many ways in which we can connect these phenomena to economics. So just in the case of COVID, we've known basically from the end of January last year that we, in fact, were in a pandemic. That this was that SARS-CoV-2 was spreading throughout the entire world, and it was obvious, really, from early March last year that we had lost control of it. So we've known very, very quickly that this was a pandemic. Imagine that all our discussions about the Black Death, we've only been looking at partial evidence all this time. So what Jan was saying before about not knowing how much we don't know, that's what shocks me, is how much we don't know about these pasts. And that's why also it's alarming, it's very scary to me to think how comfortable we've been in that ignorance of thinking, oh, we know how to take care of a pandemic. We'll just, throw a few nurses into the room. We won't worry about whether or not they have the supplies in terms of what they need. We won't think through, we won't budget. We'll in fact de-budget. We will de-escalate the investments that have been made in pandemic preparedness, which is certainly what's happened here in the US over the course of the last presidential administration. So that's the biggest thing that I would say, is that where we think we're comfortable in our knowledge about making comparisons with the past, I would urge caution. I would say, don't think that you know as much as you do, because there's a lot of assumptions. I have read a fair amount of, so anything basically that gets published these days about the Black Death, I at least have a glance at it. And what I've seen in a lot of economic literature is they're just recycling old data. They're not looking afresh at the primary sources. And I find that very, very scary. I find that very scary. We need much, much better historical understanding in order to draw comparisons.
Thank you, Professor Green. That was very informative. Something struck me very vividly in what you said, in all that you said, the non-uniformity of the demographic impact of the Black Death epidemic. If you could dwell a little more on that, on account of what reasons was this non-uniformity?
Well, this is one of the things that I mean when I'm saying how much we don't know. It is 100% clear that we know the pathogen that was involved in the Black Death, which is Yersinia pestis, which is the disease that we still understand as plague. Plague is distributed throughout the world today. I live in Arizona. We have plague here in Arizona. And the reason we have plague here in Arizona is because it was never controlled in the Middle Ages. The strain of plague that we have here in Arizona is a direct descendant of the Black Death strain. That's the same strain, or it's a related strain that's in Madagascar now, that almost every year is causing multiple human cases in Madagascar. Anyway, I could make a list of all the places that have plague that is in animal reservoirs, and that is a very big concern about COVID-19, is that it might get into, we know transmission into mink, and it's been found in some zoo animals that have close human contact. But the threat that it might might become a widespread zoonotic is absolutely terrifying. So all of that is to say is that we as historians can study plague in the past because the plague in the past is so very similar to the plague that can be studied by scientists now. So I've been reading for the last 6 to 8 years, I've been reading more scientific literature than I have historical literature, just because what the scientists are doing in their the laboratory studies or field studies of how plague behaves is of potential relevance to my interpretations as a historian. Okay, what we cannot say, so we can be very clear about what we know about that. We cannot be at all clear about what the mechanism of transmission is. We have no fleas. I mean, I don't know of a single study that has ever found a flea from the 14th century and say, okay, here's a flea that we know was carrying plague in it. We have no documentation about the vectors. We can make all kinds of speculations about the vectors, but we have no direct documentation about the vectors. And without that, so plague is an animal disease that gets into humans. So we have the bacterium, we have the vectors, which is the fleas, we have rats or other kinds of rodents that are transmitting it. And then somehow the fleas go from those rodents into humans. But it can also be transmitted directly from human to human through pneumonic plague. So if it gets in your lungs, it can become essentially a respiratory illness. What we don't know is the exact mechanisms of transmission. So what is the difference between a town where we know plague arrives and there's a very small outbreak and a town where it comes and 1,000 people a day are dying? What is the differential? We don't know. That is scary, that is profound, and that is still very true. There might be syndemics. There might be more than one pathogen circulating. So maybe there's something that there's already a viral disease that's in a certain population, and then plague comes, and because of the synergy between the virus and the bacterium, there's a different kind of manifestation of the disease. So differential outcomes seem to be indicated by our historical sources, but we cannot explain why. We have no mechanism of explaining why at this point. Certainly a mechanism of transmission, of distance transmission, is grain supplies. I'm pretty well convinced that long distance shipment of grain supplies is a big factor in how plague gets from one place to another place that might be hundreds of miles away. And that's because of the economy of this period. So just to give an example of the implications of not knowing these things. There was a study that just came out, I think it was in Nature, the biggest science journal. This was just a few weeks ago, arguing about resilience, that we need to look at resilience when we're studying climate change. So I've been reading a lot of the work of climate scientists and historians too. And they say, oh, look how resilient early modern Europe was. It was, despite the little ice age having arrived and these much cooler temperatures having come in, and the impacts on grain production locally, they adapted by importing lots of grain from other regions. And I'm here as a plague historian raising my hand and saying, excuse me, many of the places where they're importing the grain from are plague reservoirs. So they are addressing one problem, the need for grain, by creating another problem, bringing in a devastatingly lethal infectious disease. And of course, all of this is unknowing. So that's a bigger factor, is they don't understand in the past. There might be a lot of factors that right now, I'm not sure I've seen any reasonable explanation about why we're seeing the surge in India right now. the people can spin off ideas about new variants of the disease. That's very clear with plague. Is plague is not evolving fast enough to explain these differentials. It's not the pathogen, it's the modes of transmission. There's something else going on, and we don't know what that something else was.
Okay, I think that that really helps a lot, Monica. And forgive me for my dog. She's definitely going to be giving during the symposium. But I think Saumya had to take a quick short run, so he's going to be back just soon. And he did share that he really loved the thoughts that you just shared, Monica. And hey, I think Saumya's here. Would you?
Hi,
Yes.
hi, Professor Green. Sorry. So thank you very much. That was very instructive, and especially, what struck me was that once again I noticed that pandemics can be out and about historically, if I might say so, without us noticing them. For instance, I saw that in the Black Death.
Actually, if I could add one more thing, that one of the things that I realized that I'm doing is that I'm diverging from the way most other historians of medicine have been talking about the present pandemic. Is they're bringing in examples of epidemics. So this epidemic, that epidemic, and so forth. And the basic difference, and Jan has already given us the definition for pandemic, it means all people. I would have to say, and it's all things, all living things, so that we need to look across species. That it's not simply a One Health approach, but it's basically, again, looking at the evolution of the pathogen. But I think our error in looking at epidemics is we only look at it when it's right in our face. And what we need to do, and I think this would help in addressing some of the issues that Jan raised, is to take the example of the vaccine testing. The reason this is urgent is not because we didn't know that we needed vaccines. It's not because we didn't know that there would be new need for vaccines coming along. The reason it's urgent is we didn't prepare on the basis of that knowledge. And what I see by taking an evolutionary look is that none of the bacteria, none of the viruses that have caused any pandemic in history is new. It was already existing somewhere. And there are ways that we can get a better understanding, even if it's a surprise, of where this particular virus comes from, where this particular bacteria comes from. We can do a much better job at thinking between those epidemic peaks to looking at pandemics. And that's one of the things that I've done is I'm talking about tuberculosis as a long-term pandemic. I'm talking about measles as a long-term pandemic, because these are diseases that come into human societies and then just keep spinning. HIV is a long-term pandemic. So just looking at those epidemic peaks, yes, we need to treat them as crises that need emergency interventions, but we need to look at what is sustaining them between the peaks. Anyway, I'll stop there.
I just noticed Jan had raised his hand. So please go forward, Jan.
Thank you, Monica, for a very interesting talk on the history of plagues. Two associations. The first, you put emphasis that you, as a historian, you also make use of genetic knowledge, and this reminds me first of a sentence in the preface of a 3-volume work of Joachim Wach on the history of interpretations in the 19th century, and where he says, the world how it is and how it was is something we all strive to understand. That's the reason we do history. That's the reason we do philosophy. It is not true that to understand everything means to forgive everything, but only the one who tries to understand will live. And it strikes me, I mentioned this bilateral politics of the affluent countries in the world under the present pandemic, but also after Monica's talk, it strikes me also that if you look at the research community, also the research community is in a way organized in a similar way. We are working within our own silos. There is too little collaboration between hardcore scientists, historians, philosophers, social scientists. And if we look at the distribution of resources that has been allocated for research in relation to the pandemic, 95% of all resources has gone to medical and health related research, because there is this, very naive belief that it is medicine that will save us from this pandemic. We do not need philosophy. We do not need social scientists. We do not need political science. We need medical action. Just think about the comedy that billions of dollars were used to test whether hydrochloroquine would work. There were not just one study, there were thousands of studies involving hundreds of thousands of patients. Complete waste of money. I wanted also to comment briefly, because it relates to what Monica said, to a question from Sarah, I think. She said, should one not also in the teaching of research ethics include the colonial history of medical and health related research, not just the atrocities during the Second World War? Just to illustrate this, and I answered Sarah, I said, in research ethics courses, we should look into both the past and present history of colonial research. Why do I mention present? And that relates to the topic of Monica. In September 2014, Science published a study about the outbreak of the last Ebola disaster in 3 African countries, and they used genetics to trace the origin of this outbreak, and it goes back to a traditional healer from New Guinea who fell ill and died. During the burial of this man, 13 women were infected. Why? Because they were taking farewell with the deceased in the traditional way by embracing and kissing the body, and they got infected. Well, that shows also how important historical knowledge about traditions is. But what is the colonial part? 50 co-authors were on this paper. And in the paper, and it was published in Science, in the paper it is stated, all authors contributed on equal terms. 5 of the local people who were listed as co-authors, they died as a result. 4 were infected and died of the Ebola. The 5th got a stroke. In spite of the fact that the 15 authors, according to the paper, contributed the same, who do you think were listed as the first author and the last author? And you know, in medical and health related research, it's on all the 2 most important places is first and last. Well, these 2 were 2 professors from Harvard, the United States of America. This is for me a paradigmatic example of present colonial research and collaborative injustice. They didn't even make enough efforts to protect the local people who gathered the blood samples and packed them and sent them to the United States. And they honored the deceased by listing them as co-authors and claiming all contributed the same. But certainly we from Harvard the richest university in the world, we take the first and last place.
Right. So that really...
Yes, I know that study. I was following the Ebola outbreak as it unfolded.
Right. And I think I'm going to pick up on one of the, and this is going to lead us to our next segment, which is about the symposium specific questions. And one of the themes that Jan has raised when he talked about this was the naive conception of social science that people tend to have. And one of the ideas of the first segment was that all the audience now know what each of our panel speakers have worked on. And, you know, we can see if there are certain areas of intersections and certain divergences that we can go into when we are in the second segment. So the second segment is talking about the actual theme of the symposium, which is on the role of social scientists in the pandemic. And I thought we could start by looking at a bust the myth around kind of thing, that the naive conception of social sciences. So during the pandemic situation, there is a certain sense in which, at least early on, when sciences were mentioned publicly, it was always conflated with physical sciences alone, that is either epidemiology and virology. Even today, as it was shown by Follow the Science trend, there's a certain way in which human or social sciences are not really considered vital to the process of responding to the crises. We thought we could start by looking at where you could share, you know, all our panel speakers, if you could share any misconceptions or areas of ignorance about the role of social science. Have you encountered these during your experience as researchers with the pandemic situation? So anyone who might be interested in taking, you know, Monica or Jan or Aliya.
I'd be glad to address that in terms of history, and that's simply that I have encountered this over and over again, and it was not simply during the pandemic. It's been in previous encounters communicating with scientists, which is the assumption that history is fixed. History happened in the past, it can't possibly change, and therefore, you know, why not just, you know, pull data off of Wikipedia? I mean, that with just so little conception of history as a research field, any conception that history, our historical narratives change when we have new information. I mean, and that's why I've been able to redate the Black Death, is because I had new information. And I took the new information and then put it into a dialogue with the old information and figured out, okay, why had we been misunderstanding this? So that's just huge, is that just because it's the past, technically the past can't change, but the past can change in terms of our knowledge of it. So really just going back to what Jan was saying, how much we don't know. And a lot of what we don't know is simply because we've never asked the questions.
Okay. Yeah, Jan, please.
Yeah, I don't know whether Monica would agree with me, but for me, I would define history as the most important academic discipline to understand the present.
I agree entirely.
Okay, so now that we have looked at that, Aliya, would you like to add in anything? And would you like to add, as a sociologist, what kind of misconceptions or areas of ignorance you might have heard people having?
Yeah, sure. I think it's not like a misunderstanding as much as it is a sense of irrelevance. And I think especially when it comes to, you know, I teach qualitative research methods here. I'm a sociologist by training, but that's what I teach here. And this sense that somehow that's not data. Data only comes in the form of numbers and stats and things like that. And I mean, like all we are seeing right now, like, you know, whether it's vaccine hesitancy, whether it's not following, like, you know, sanitization or wearing masks or whatever it might be, a lot of that, some in India, like a lot in the US, in the UK where I am right now, this is explained, I think, by talking to people, by understanding, okay, like, where is this vaccine hesitancy, for instance, coming from? Why is not wearing a mask, why has that become such a key part of your identity? That you're like, I mean, I will die for this right to not wear a mask, right? Like that's where sociologists, I think, are doing some really great work about how identity, like belonging in a group and so on, is shaping that. And I think it's really a lot of qualitative researchers who are doing that, who are kind of doing the in-depth interviews, who are doing the observations and so on. So yeah, I would just add that this idea of what data is and what can inform how we understand the social world, I think it still remains a bit narrow.
Okay, Jan, yes, please.
Maybe a provocative question or comments. Might it be? And I think you are absolutely right, Aliya, that many hardcore researchers or so-called empirical researchers, they consider social sciences and the humanities irrelevant academic disciplines. But might it also be that many, both social scientists and humanistic scholars, they, in order to become more respected, they try to become more and more similar to empirical researchers. I would love if social scientists and scholars of the humanities join forces and say, our aim is to speak truth to power. Our aim is to focus on the taboos in reality. You know, the ancient Greek playwrights, why did they write comedies? They wrote comedies because that was the only way you could criticize those in power. And that's also the reason why comic playwrights were those considered the most dangerous in society. I think we as social scientists, bioethicists, and scholars of the humanities, we should become much more equal to comic figures, to disclose and deconstruct taboos, speak truth to power, and show the horrible things going on today, but where the rhetoric that dominates is, well, vaccine nationalism is a problem, well, solidarity is a nice thing. You know, on September 11, 2020, the United Nations General Assembly issued a resolution on the COVID-19, where they pleaded for solidarity, where they say we need to work together so that all needy groups in the world get access to vaccines at the same time. 2 months later, it became known that all the affluent countries in the world had negotiated bilaterally with the vaccine producers and hoarded all the most of the vaccines that will become accessible for the next 2 years. 169 countries voted in favor of this resolution, some abstained, and 2 countries voted against. And who do you think those 2 countries were? United States of America and Israel.
I mean, just to kind of quickly respond, if I have the time, is that, yeah?
Please.
Yeah, please.
I think, yeah, your points are like really good. And I would just say, like, you know, one of the methodological pieces that I've written, and like what I try to convey to my students is that, you know, as a kind of qualitative researcher, you ultimately, like, you do not have to use the language of numbers and kind of shroud yourself behind, like, you know, my sample has like 100 interviews or like, you know, whatever, like that kind of stuff, that, you know, the ultimate goal is different. And I think it's worth considering, and I try to do it, it's social science and it's a craft as well, because you're trying to make sense. There's so much interpretation going on there. Based on evidence, of course. But so I think firstly, that's really important. And I had a second point, but that's sort of slipped my mind right now. So I'll stop for the time being.
Definitely. And so just continuing with that, on the background of these kind of misconceptions or, you know, common areas of ignorance, we wondered if we could look at a more informed conception of social science. So for you, what constitutes social science or humanities? What is the aspect of your discipline for you personally that makes it a science of, say, society or humanity? Also, more importantly, in a crisis situation like the current one, what were the times where you felt that, okay, if we added this understanding of society and humanity, we might have been able to manage the situation better? Would anyone like to take, or any of the seats?
I'll go ahead.
Yeah.
One of the things that I'm doing, but it's also what has allowed me to do what I'm doing is I'm taking a global historical approach to my work. So I'm trained as a Europeanist, but what I've realized I had to do with the plague work is go outside of Europe. And go outside of Europe into areas where I don't have the languages, into areas where there are no documents for anybody with any language to read. But what's given me kind of the gumption to do that is I'd already started teaching, literally it was History 100. It was global history to 1500. So I created a structure from scratch. And I looked at what other global historians are doing. And the most powerful analysis that I found was talking about scale. So the more territory, geographic territory you try to encompass as a historian, the thinner your analysis gets. But what a global historical approach does is say, okay, we're going to look at different scales, that certain questions can be usefully examined by looking at different scales. So those scales would, for most global historians, would say be local, national, regional, continental, intercontinental, and then fully global. What I've added is the microbial. So I've gone down a level, but I'm still going back up and saying, okay, well, what about the rats? What about the humans? What about the grain supplies? What about the climate that's in shifting the places where grain can be grown? And it has been transformative. And then that has allowed me to go to specialists in other geographic areas who have the languages, who have the archival knowledge, and say, listen, I think there's a problem we should talk about mutually. And so I have developed over the course of the last 8 years, just a phenomenal collaborative work with historian of China. I just had a piece come out on the history of the fall of Baghdad in the 13th century, and was able to, I mean, number one, these were wonderful people to work with and very, very generous. But the thing is that I was able to give them enough ideas to work with. Say, well, what would happen if you went back to your source, which only you can read, and found this? So anyway, I would say that that's one of the ways. And again, it also pushes me out into other disciplines as well, of engaging with the science in various kinds of modes. So I would say that sometimes expanding the scope of what we try to do can be enriching and empowering, and have this incredible benefit of bringing more people to the table of saying, oh, this is important.
Yeah, Jan, would you like to please go forward?
Yeah, I liked this reference of Monica to expanding and also to language. Just I have had the fortune of learning many foreign languages, and the first beautiful experience with that is that it is when you learn and speak several other languages that you understand things of your own mother language that you never had understood before. But that brings me also to the question, well, what kind of data are in a way the most important data of social sciences and the humanities? I would say it's words. And if we look at the history of science, it is not vaccines, it is not technology. It is words that have had the most important impact on the way humanity has developed. Words are extremely powerful things, and we should be proud of saying, when we talk with our hardcore empirical researchers, okay, You can work with your things, and we will work with our words, and maybe we can start talking together also, because you also have words. You see the background behind me? This is an ancient representation of a monster, a chimeric entity from ancient Greece. It's the head of a lion, and then the second head of a goat, and then the tail of a serpent. I am coordinating since 1st of February a new research project on organoid research. It is a new research trajectory in medical basic research, trying to create organized clusters of cells that are less complex than organs, but more complex than cells, to overcome the translation gaps between research done on rats and mice, and transfer the results, translate the results to the human sphere. And the wonderful thing is to acknowledge that 2,500 years ago, 3,500 years ago, in ancient Greek and mythology, or you can go to Egyptian mythology or Chinese or Indian mythology, and you find these imaginations of living entities shaped by different animals. And organoids are exactly this. But I have this as the background also to remind me, human beings' narrative imagination. 2,500 years ago, human beings were able to imagine what is going on now in basic medical research. For example, in one of the most prestigious medical journals last week, it's named Cell, it was published a study where they had used an embryo from a monkey, and they had put into this embryo monkey brain cells from a human embryo. This is a modern version of what is displayed on this plate behind my back. Narrative imagination, that's what makes us humans. And maybe that is also the strength of social sciences and the humanities. We use our narrative imagination, we use our words, and behind or in those words and in this imagination, there is an enormous potential.
And in continuation with that, I thought we could look at one small aspect of, like you had talked about, the idea of subject of words, the importance of words. So I thought that before moving on to talking about methodology, we could talk about, coming to the pulp of our theme, the social scientists. We wanted to focus on a specific aspect of the situation. Very roughly, one of the reasons physical sciences are often revered is the lack of subjectivity. There is a certain sense in which the elimination of subjectivity is considered to be preferable than to its inclusion within a study. So have you come across such a view in your experience in conversations that compares physical and social sciences? So what do you think is the value of subjectivity for studying a situation like the current one? So anyone would like to take that up? Jan?
I will start with that, and it builds off of what Jan was saying. As I said before, I've drawn from global history this idea of scalar analysis, of saying that certain kinds of analyses, certain methodologies are to be used at different scales. And there's different sources of information. And the important thing is that when you see it that way, one doesn't trump the other. Is that if you're looking at bacteria, then you have to use scientific methods, because the scientific means to document bacteria, whether in a laboratory context or a molecular analysis, that's the work that scientists do. And they have their methodologies, they have their criteria, their protocols, and so forth. I have the same things when I'm reading documents, which are human generated. So I'm at the human scale of analysis. And when you're reading human documents, there are certain kinds of analyses you have to use. And this is one of the things that drives, for example, art historians crazy, and also, frankly, medical historians, of somebody coming along and seeing a picture of something from the past and doing a retrospective diagnosis of it. And it's just like, no, you cannot do that. You have to understand there are conventions of art that are peculiar to that time. That is the language of art. And that you work in a certain kind of idiom. It's a certain kind of grammar. There are certain kinds of cultural references. There's certain things that you would never do, or certain things that it might look like to us, it looks like you're trying to do, but in fact, you person in the past had completely different intentions. And so that's what I do. When I'm working on the human level, I'm saying culture, 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 culture. And all the ways that humanities and social sciences have spent centuries honing our analyses of how to document what humans do. If we want to look at dendrochronology, yes, that's a different story. So it really just, it's kind of just reinforcing the necessity and the vitalness of saying different kinds of evidence and different kinds of phenomena demand different techniques. Full stop.
Yeah, that's true. And hey, Aliya, is there anything you might be interested in adding to the conversation between subjectivity and objectivity?
Yeah, I actually had thoughts on the last question. Can I share those?
Yes, please. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, what I had about that was, and this was like linked to what Jan had also said earlier, which was, this idea of like being able to speak truth to power. So there's like a big debate in social science, and especially like in my discipline of sociology, about whether you can be like a scholar activist. And it really kind of comes down a lot to status, right? Like, do you get status if you do speak truth to power within the university setting? Like, what is that reward? And because that rewards, at least in the US and in the UK, and I think in most places, like, peer-reviewed publications and so on, that gets diminished a little bit. And that also speaks to your question, which you'd asked earlier about how do we need to be expanding our knowledge during this time? And I think this gets back to what Jan was saying earlier, this idea of you know a lot, but you don't think enough. And I actually think we've seen that with research during coronavirus, because when you look at the stuff that's been produced about the coronavirus from every discipline, it's like in the millions. Like, this is new research that I don't know who's going to read this, but I don't know that we are thinking through our new research designs or why we are asking the questions very carefully. I think we're trying to fulfill a university function. I think it's very prosaic, right? This is not about knowledge as much as it is about like climbing up the promotion ladder. And I think, one example of this is, I think the issue of paid and unpaid work and how that's divided, like gender equality, I think this really matters. And at the same time, like, there's this preponderance of research on the division of paid and unpaid work all over, people pivoting whatever they were doing earlier, moving to that, and that with not very thoughtful research designs that I don't think can necessarily make big claims. So I think we need to rethink that, and maybe like, I might advocate for like a slow, some people call it a slow sociology, but like slow disciplines where you're spending some time thinking why you're asking the questions you're asking, even what purchase do they get you. So a little bit about that. With subjectivity, what I've thought about it is like, I think, yeah, there's different kinds of knowledge, but I think it's like pretty foolish to think about science or really anything is objective. Like, I would very much question that, because when you look even at what objectivity in like these kind of, physical hard sciences is, like, historians and philosophers of science have shown this, right? That what was objectivity in the 1700s might be not like what the picture of what the rose actually is. It's an ideal form of the rose that then shifted to having a picture of the rose that then shifted to something else. So like, even what it means to be objective has not, as historians have pointed out, that's been always historically contingent. So I don't find it a very useful concept, especially in the social sciences, where I think it's an impossible task. And I think all it does is like makes you hide and kind of bury your own epistemic kind of preconceptions.
I published some years ago, I published a provocative paper with the title Bioethics on the Couch, and where I asked the question why bioethics and other humanistic and social science disciplines are in need of therapy. And it relates to the description of the current situation you mentioned earlier. More and more social scientists and also human science researchers, they are fully occupied with researching the implications of questions formulated by the hardcore scientists, because the funding is there. And this has one extremely important side effect, that there is less and less basic research, both in the humanities and in the social sciences. And what happens with an academic discipline if basic research is not funded, and scholars in these two disciplines do not do the work they should do? Okay, it might be important also to research the implications of questions posed by the hardcore scientists. But if we, more and more of us, do only that, what will happen with the humanities and the social sciences? They will lose, and soon, and we see, for example, in the UK, they have closed down a lot of social science institutes and human science institutes. And instead, they are redistributing the funding to big life science projects for the real scientists.
Mhm.
And this is extremely dangerous in the long run.
Mhm.
But I think also, as Aliya said, well, this distinction, subjectivity and objectivity, this is a language of power. And those who use it, they use it against the social scientists. And well, you just produce opinions. You do not really generate new facts. You are on a, you are activists. You are not scientists. But look at history. Look at history of the universities. Which scientific academic disciplines have had the greatest impact in the history of humankind? It is not natural sciences. It is not medical and health related research. It is the humanities and social sciences.
If I could add just one more point there, what I am finding as I'm moving across, again, these different scales to reconstruct the history of plague, and I've also worked on, to a lesser extent, on other infectious diseases, is that what I have found necessary, but also an excellent challenge, is the fact that I have to, whatever I come up with doing my humanist analysis, working on the with cultural analyses at this human scale, I have to go back and check my results against the other scales as well. Does what I'm saying correlate with what we know about climate? Does it correlate with what we know about the evolution of the bacterium? And that's been incredibly constructive for me, because I'm very rarely drawing on any kind of quantification for the work that I'm doing, but I am embedding the scientific evidence as part of my evidence and as part of my narrative. And I would say the one word that I have found new respect for is narrative, is that whatever I come up with, it needs to make sense. And it is astounding how much stuff in many different disciplines get published that don't make sense. I mean, don't make sense in terms of connecting to other stories and saying, this is how this relates to that. So I would just add is that this is just one way that we can show the value of our work. I hope I have slowly been getting indications from scientists that they've read my most recent work on plague and at least kind of nodded in agreement. I don't, we'll see. It will take longer to see if they fully agree. It will take longer to see if I'm right, frankly, but making that effort to try to correlate. So for example, this would be a question I would give to Aliya is, how your work, if you tried to put it aside alongside an economic history that saw itself as a fully economic history, would you see differences? Would you see correlations? Because I think if we are, once we recognize that there is a gap in communication, I think we should face those directly as much as we can, and have the time and energy to do so. But that's where I have found my best results, is saying, okay, there's something anomalous here. There's something that doesn't fit. What's wrong? Is the data wrong? Is the interpretation wrong? Is there kind of a gap? Is there a missing puzzle that we're lacking? So anyway, I would just throw that out. I think that is good. It can be painful. It can be ego bruising to do that, to step outside of our comfortable disciplinary niches, but I think it's incredibly valuable. And it's necessary. I mean, with the pandemic, it is absolutely necessary.
Is there anything that you'd like to add, Aliya? Is there anything you'd like to say? Or I could throw the next question. Yeah.
Sure, but okay, so this is also about power. So I do actually cite economists. I engage with their stuff, not too much, because I think their models on the family and unemployment, how that would mean, are very, I don't think we need to be paying attention to them, because they've been wrong for 2 decades now, right? Since Gary Becker's the rational model hasn't worked. I do engage with it, but that's the thing. When you look at kind of citation counts and who's citing who, social scientists are engaging with economists. Economists are engaging with themselves. Political scientists are engaging a little bit more with economists. Sociologists, are here and there, whatever, but everyone is engaging with economists. So this is about and they also have a lot of policy. And I know there's a sociologist writing a book on how economists in the US especially got the policy, but this is where that power thing and about whose knowledge counts and whose knowledge counts practically, that's where that comes in. So yeah, but I do engage with it, because I think I have to, in a way, because I would get asked, then what about this model? Or what about that model?
Yeah.
And that just reminds me of one question before I move and hand over to Juhi for the last wrap-up question. I wanted to sort of look at decolonization. We already talked about that, and the fact that we are from India and we are doing this event in the current context. And I wanted to ask our 3 speakers if you must have looked at many ethical frameworks which have been sort of built responding to the crisis situation, and there has been a certain sense in which there has been a neglect, many have felt, of the global South situation, because often, when you look at things like social distancing, it's a distant, far dream for places like India or Africa, I guess. So, what historical or philosophical or sociological lessons do you think could we draw on to make sure that the social contexts of the countries are taken into account and are not neglected when we are making such frameworks? And do we really think there can be a general ethical framework which could apply to all countries, like the one size fits all kind of ethical framework?
Well, I think from my perspective as a bioethicist, I think it's important to recall Article 1 of the Declaration of Human Rights, which is a visionary article when it states every human being is born free and equal in terms of dignity. Well, an empirical interpretation of this article would say, well, this is completely crap, because we know that to be born in Oslo compared to be born in Mogadishu represents a dramatic difference when it comes to the possibility of living a life where it is possible for those individuals to realize their capabilities. So if we think about, okay, is it possible to develop a global ethics framework that is applicable everywhere, then it should be designed in this way. How can we organize the world, both globally, regionally, nationally, and locally, in such a way that every human being born on this planet will be able to be and do in the way he or she wants. That is, to realize her capabilities in the way she wants. And we are far from that.
Right.
We are far from that. But contextualization, okay, if we really believe the visions of Article 1 of the Declaration of Human Rights, that everybody is born free and equal in terms of dignity, then dignity, this article applied, means we have an obligation wherever we live and whatever power we are entitled to apply, we have an obligation to try to make it possible for every human being to realize her capabilities in the way he or she wants. But that requires contextualization. That requires to put aside the one size fit all thinking.
Would Monica or Aliya would like to add anything to what Jan had said, or would you like to?
I'd be happy to. It's just again the great value that I see in a global historical perspective. And I think the history of infectious diseases is the best way to do it, precisely because, as any epidemiologist will tell you, infectious diseases know no borders. We desperately needed a global framework of analysis, 15 months ago for the COVID pandemic. We need it desperately now. And again, this is also why I see the focus on epidemics, which is, at least in my field, history of medicine, is extremely Eurocentric, US-centric. And it's just like, the epidemic is over when those areas are free, or when certain cities are free. Yeah. Then the epidemic is over. Looking at it as a pandemic, you're seeing the continued transmission of the pathogen. The pathogen is never over until the pathogen is gone everywhere. And so that means that there's no way of excluding the South. There's no way of excluding anybody, even within, the notion that Peter Hotez developed a few years ago, this idea of blue marble health, of looking at the pockets of poverty and disease, even in the wealthiest countries. We need global health analyses there too. So we need it everywhere. So that's the very big thing that I would say is infectious diseases is the best model for doing that.
Aliya, is there anything that you would like to share on this? No? Okay.
No, that was a tough question, and I'd have to think long and hard about it. So I think these are great responses.
Great. So I'm going to pass this on to Juhi for the last question before we can go for the question and answer. Juhi, please, you can take it.
Yeah, thank you, Sahana. Actually, my question is coming from our concern toward the methodologies that we need to employ for the researches that we are going to do in light of this pandemic. Like, how do we go to understand the normative aspects of a crisis situation, basically? Because like one thing that has been bothering me recently is the situation that we have arrived towards, is all the misinformation that is coming towards, and every time what we are hearing is a kind of accusations from the system to the people, like add people to the system. And in here, like two areas that have emerged, especially in India, that is systematic failure and lifestyle issues. So like, how do we go about in choosing our proper tools to go for some kind of pragmatic uh, I know our subjects need long time to understand this kind of havoc that has been happening, but some kind of pragmatic solutions to the issues that have emerged right now. How do we deal with that? Like if you can help us here in understanding through all your respective subjects.
I will jump in
Yes.
and say that as a historian, which is probably going to, most people would say, is the least relevant and the least immediately helpful discipline for an ongoing and very urgent outbreak. I would say all the ways in which we are and should be creating an educational agenda right at the moment of, and especially in regard to that disinformation. Why is the disinformation, why are these disinformation campaigns successful? Because we have populations who don't understand virology, they don't understand the immune system of the body, they don't understand what vaccines are, how they work. Least of all do they understand where diseases come from and how they spread. The xenophobia that we've been seeing. I mean, you know, we should have taken care of that back in the Middle Ages, in the sense of having people understand that diseases move through populations, and that it doesn't do any good for us to blame people because the disease is already spreading. So there's what I see is that we should be developing that educational agenda right now, as we have all of these crises in front of us, and saying, what did we not know? What did the general public not know that really should have just been, you know, automatic? That should have just been basic science, basic epidemiology, basic political literacy that we should have had in place, just like the PPE.
Yeah. Actually, if we can elaborate, like the other speakers, if they can elaborate on what gaze actually should we have, like where should we look into, through what perspective we should look into towards knowing the basic cause of the pandemic that has occurred. So, like, Jan and Aliya, if you can elaborate on this, take up discussion. Thank you, Monica. Yeah.
I have something to add. I mean, I agree with Monica that it's like, you know, it's about an educational campaign. I don't necessarily think it needs to be about like teaching science and, you know, immunology. I think that's important. But I think at this point, we were dealing with really fundamental stuff about not being able to critically discern fact from fiction, right? Like
Exactly.
especially, like, you know, where WhatsApp forwards have like become the new way of getting news or whatever, or even news has like no facts. You know, the media is like not offering facts, they're just making up whatever. So I think like we need like a very basic respect for evidence and for like what's actually true and what's kind of made up back, that requires some sort of critical thinking, and teaching that from schools. But also I think this is an ideological thing, right? Like, I mean, this is a kind of disdain for expertise. And it's very evident in India, where like, you know, experts have been consulted for anything and they've been ignored, in fact, blatantly so. It was very evident in the US, where, you know, like, I mean, you can just see it from the images of like Dr. Fauci, right? Like the way he was when Trump was giving his addresses and the way he is now behind like Biden when he's been like smiling and just been happy or whatever. It's there. It's like, it's the way that scientists and other experts have been treated throughout this. So, I mean, I think it's like a very fundamental question of critical thinking, discerning fact from like non-fact, and valuing expertise, I guess. I don't know that you can do it during the middle of a pandemic. I don't know if that's a time to roll these things out. But
yeah, I completely understand. But yes, given the situation, we are. If I'm audible, like.
You're audible.
Yeah. Actually, given the situation, the thing is that what I feel like, and through through several works, like especially yours, Aliya, what we have churned up is that we are still there only, like 20 years back, into the development we thought that we have reached around like gender roles. So, like in their kind of a situation, what we are looking towards to work to work in consideration of filling that gap that again pandemic has brought us towards.
Could I comment?
Yeah, please. Yeah,
You
please.
when you raised your question, you used the word tool.
Yeah.
I don't think the tools are missing. I completely agree with Monica and Aliya that education is core. We know all studies on how diseases, the prevalence of diseases in different regions of the world, the parameter which always comes out as the most important parameter is education. But I think, well, some years ago, the American philosopher Harry Frankfurt published this small book entitled Bullshit, which is a brilliant analysis of public rhetoric and the rhetoric of politicians and those in power, and where he pleads for some kind of deconstruction. I think the challenge under the present pandemic is how could we develop a language that connect with people and not the opposite, disrupt. And I don't think it is just the distinction, truth and fact. To recall a quote from one of my heroes, Albert Schweitzer, the French physician, theologian, philosopher, and specialist of Bach, who ended up in Gabon in sub-Saharan Africa, where he built the hospital and lived for 50 years. He said that of all human inventions, stupidity is the biggest thing God ever created. And his point was, probably we are the most intelligent living being on this planet, but no other living being is able to use his or her intelligence in such stupid ways as we human beings do from time to time. Because I think when you see, for example, in the US now, the divide between vaccine skepticists and vaccine defenders, it is the majority of the skeptics are among those voting Republicans. Many of these people are highly educated. So what the heck is going on? And I think the challenge is how do we develop a language that build bridges, that connect with people on all different levels. And I don't think enlightenment is sufficient. There must be something more than that. And here we, from the social and human sciences, have an extremely important task, because the hardcore researchers will never be able to construct such a language.
Thank you. Yeah.
So thank you so much for, I think that was a great question, Juhi, and what wonderful answers. I think today, right now, we can move on to the next and the final question and answer session. In case any of our audience has any questions, please feel free to raise your hands or put it in the chat box as well. And, we can just take a moment and give people the time to gather their thoughts and do that. And in case our speakers are up to answering some questions that actually Juhi and we all were discussing some questions, and we thought we could just ask one of those to you guys while we wait for our audience to share their questions. So let me see. Let me start with our question on, this is for Aliya actually. We had thought about that. Home, like you have talked about how home is an important space during the pandemic, and your book showed that the home is a really important space for thinking about experience of unemployment. Usually when we think about the pandemic, we're thinking about the hospital, or we're thinking about, institutes. So we wanted to ask you, do you feel like you need to attend more to this space, this home, given that there's a rise in both home working and unemployment due to the COVID pandemic? What really motivated you to look at home as this space to talk about this?
Sure. So I want to clarify, my book is not about the pandemic, right? My book is about unemployment prior to the pandemic. And what I'm arguing there is that the home becomes a space, like a very gendered space, right? It becomes a sort of resource for men where they get like sort of like a demarcated space, like a home office that's either created for them or that's updated so they can job search effectively. And for women, they're sort of like, well, the whole home is your domain. And so therefore you don't have any specific place there, right? Which kind of works against them in a way. I think and I also want to clarify that, this is, like I said, it's white collar unemployed people, right? So what the home means in that context is very different than what the home might mean for, more elite people or lower wage workers and so on. So yeah, in this sort of relatively privileged context, the home serves as an important space for basically reinforcing gender roles. That's an argument I'm making. And I think, again, for similarly privileged workers during the pandemic, that seems to be playing out a little bit. Like we don't actually have data on this yet of any kind about how people kind of shared the home when everyone was home all the time, including people who would normally have gone to, offices or whatever it might be to work in. But it does seem that it might have been a sort of, replication or perpetuation of what I kind of found, that, who gets like the bigger space, the better space, and who doesn't. That those kinds of processes playing out. So I think that's been important. I think that this matters for this kind of revolution in homeworking that everyone thinks is coming. I don't know if that's going to come, because when you already look at corporations, a lot of them want their employees back right now. Even when it's not that safe, or they want them back they want to start having that conversation. So I don't know whether that's going to happen or not. Yeah.
Right. So, okay, this is a question for Jan. So there has been a lot of emphasis on decolonizing medicine and health, and this is somewhat what Sarah had also raised in her comment, and you had also answered to her. So on one hand, many a times the indigenous traditions, though they are effective in many cases, could be, say, pseudo-scientific. Especially in the pandemic situation, there have been many versions of indigenous remedies for coronavirus, which have sort of misled many people. On the other hand, there is the challenge that perhaps it is because we are largely Eurocentric or colonized, at least intellectually, that we only support certain ways of looking at health and medicine. So how do you really look at this conflict between fact and values? In what way does the decolonization relate to research ethics? I do think that you've answered the last question, but the facts and the values tension, what do you feel about that?
Wow, it's a huge question. Let me try to answer part of it by, one of the ironies of nature is that some of the cost poorest countries in the world are some of the richest countries in the world with regard to biodiversity. What we see now, since more than 15 years back, is a dramatic race, which in some way is similar to the gold rushes in the 18th century, where there were races to be the first to dig the different gold mines in the US, in Sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, and then also the context of that, colonialization. What we now see is a new form of colonialization, but much more subtle. What happens is that because of the enormous potentials of genomic technology and genomic knowledge, we see that researchers from the global north is traveling to India, to other Asian countries, to the Amazonas, to Sub-Saharan Africa, to identify plants, microorganisms that can be used to develop the next generation of drugs and medicines. What they do is they identify them, then travel back to the countries and get access to the genetic code, and then apply for patents. This is a new form of colonialization and robbing of the richness of these parts of the world. But it's much more subtle. The killings are not so direct and visible. And what we see also is a growing tendency to what I would call collaborative injustice. I remember I was organizing a capacity building workshop in Tanzania on research ethics. And one of the participants, he said, I have participated in many international research projects, but I have never been acknowledged as co-author. Yeah. Is this, he said, collaborative justice? No, this, he said, is collaborative injustice. So I have pleaded, because I have had the luck of giving a lot of lectures and presentation on this in both Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. What these countries, and also in Asia, what these countries should do is to join forces and implement regulations that make these countries the masters of their own biological resources. If not, in 20 years' time, the affluent countries in the world will have been able to rob also these gold mines and turn it into investments for themselves. I don't know whether this was any direct answer to your question.
That did shed lights on some aspects. I'll have to get back to you with a few more thoughts on that later. But this would be the final. We are actually running short of time. So this is a last question for Monica. And so this is about visual representation of plagues and epidemics. And I remember seeing a tweet where NPR had published what was supposed to be a 15th century Bible depiction of a couple suffering from blisters of bubonic plague. And you had pointed out that that was actually not the plague. The patients shown were suffering from 6th biblical plague and the curse of festering skin boils. Do you often come across such misrepresentations of plague or epidemics? As a historian, what does such a misrepresentation take away, or what problems might be caused to it? And of course, to add to all of this, the fact that we have social media today and we have digital reproduction of images and deep fakes. So in your experience, what has your experience been with visual misrepresentation of plagues and epidemics?
Well, this is, it's actually a part of a much bigger problem, which is, for lack of a better word, just sloppiness. Analytical sloppiness. And this is, I think, one of the ways that we can very effectively teach a general public what the principles of analysis are, and seeing and making the kind of honing in on the argument that this is culture. Any artistic representation is coming from human culture. It's coming from a particular historical moment, from particular genres, that the way that the artists are trained, the way the audience that it is meant for is trained to look upon this, and to insist on historicity, to insist that words mean different things at different times, images mean different things at different times, that it's all culturally constructed and it's all culturally embedded. And then the question is, okay, once we said that, now how do we rise to a higher level of universality? Where's the universality? And this is where I say, I want to insist as a historian who really believes in biology. I believe in evolution. I believe that the physical world is real, and that we as humans are constantly engaging with it in various kinds of ways, that some of which we understand, many of which we don't understand. And so that I think it's a tremendous teaching tool, actually, because It's something people can look at, and people look at things. So again, the adage, a picture is worth 1,000 words. The question is, well, which 1,000 words?
Right.
And who gets to decide? And the points that Aliya was making is, I absolutely agree that it's not an issue of us teaching facts. It's us teaching, how do you, any person in the world, determine what is fact? How do you ask those particular questions to say, you know, if you're dealing with anything from an earlier time period, date. How have you established the date of this? There's another image that is very frequently used in discussions of plague, and that's the plague doctor. And you all know what that is. It's that, you know, the doctor with the hat and the big, it looks like goggles, and that big beak. People throw that around when they're talking about the Black Death. So the Black Death happened in the 14th century. That plague doctor outfit is not documented anywhere before the 17th century. That's a 300-year differential. Look what mistakes you're making, what analytical just nonsense you're creating when you juxtapose that image with any analysis that you're trying to make about earlier experiences with plague. So I think all of those examples are things that we can use. And again, it's just something we have to keep doing, you know, really every opportunity we get. And it's not about shaming people, saying you're wrong about this. It's encouraging people, empowering people with those analytical skills. So I just think it's a great example to use, and it's also a great example for us as social scientists and humanists to keep insisting there are rules. You can't make up anything that you want. It's not rules because of hegemony. And I would say if somebody from say a non-Western society says, well, we do things differently, then that's the basis of a conversation of why do you do things differently? How do you do things differently? That we value family more than any other kinds of social relationships. And therefore, that's the basis of certain ethical decisions that we make. Dialogue. Why? Those are all the things that we need to talk about.
Okay, that was such a wonderful answer, and we're going to have to close this session today. But I think we have had such a great conversation with all our panel speakers, and we are really grateful to all of you for coming forward and sharing your perspective with us. And as we wrap up the human side, we, the organizers, would like to thank you all, and we hope that we get to meet face to face at some point. I'm just going to share details of the panel speakers on the chat, and people can reach out to them and find their email IDs on these profiles and reach out to them. And before we go, have a great day, guys, and good night on our side. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you so much.
Thanks to everyone.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.